Mother Bear refused anesthesia. Until baby was safe in surgery, everyone was in tears. The morning mist hung low over Pine Ridge Wildlife Sanctuary like a soft gray blanket, and everything seemed quieter than usual that September day. Dr. Ethan Marshall had just finished his second cup of coffee when he heard something that made him set down his mug very slowly. It wasn't a sound exactly, more like the absence of sound where there should have been birds chirping and squirrels chattering in the trees outside the veterinary clinic. The forest had gone completely silent, and in his 15 years working with wild animals, Ethan had learned that when nature holds its breath, something extraordinary is about to happen. He walked to the window of his small office, the wooden floor creaking under his feet in that familiar way it always did, and what he saw through the foggy glass made his heart skip several beats. There, at the edge of the clearing where the forest met the sanctuary grounds, stood the largest black bear he had ever seen in his life. But it wasn't the size that made his hands tremble slightly as he reached for his radio. It was the way she stood there, perfectly still, looking directly at the clinic building with an intensity that seemed almost human. And there was something else, something cradled carefully in her massive front legs that made Ethan forget to breathe for a moment. The bear was holding a cub, and even from this distance Ethan could see the dark stain of blood against the little one's fur. The mother bear took a step forward, then another, moving with a deliberate slowness that spoke not of injury, but of careful intention. She never broke eye contact with the window where Ethan stood frozen, and in that moment, something passed between them that he would struggle to explain for the rest of his life. It was as if she knew exactly where to come, exactly who to find, and exactly what she needed. Ethan's radio crackled to life before he could press the button. "Doc, you seeing this?" The voice belonged to Jessica Brooks, the sanctuary's senior wildlife keeper who had been feeding the rescued foxes in the enclosure nearby. Her voice carried a mixture of awe and disbelief that matched exactly what Ethan was feeling. She's coming straight for the clinic. Should I call for backup? Should we evacuate? But Ethan found himself saying something that surprised even him. "No, Jessica, don't move. Don't make any sudden movements. I think she needs our help." The mother bear continued her slow approach, and now Ethan could see more clearly. The cub in her arms couldn't have been more than 4 months old, its small body limp but breathing, and there was a deep gash along its side that looked fresh, maybe only hours old. The mother's own fur was matted with mud and leaves, suggesting she had traveled a long distance through difficult terrain. But what struck Ethan most forcefully was her eyes. They weren't the eyes of a wild predator. They were the eyes of a mother, desperate and determined, and somehow trusting in a way that defied everything he knew about bear behavior. He made a decision that went against every protocol in the book. Instead of calling for tranquilizer guns and safety equipment, Ethan slowly opened the clinic's side door and stepped outside. The cool morning air hit his face, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. The mother bear stopped about 20 feet away, still holding her injured baby, and for a long moment they simply looked at each other. Then she did something that made Jessica gasp audibly from wherever she was watching. The bear gently, so gently it was almost tender, laid her cub on the ground and took 3 steps backward. She's giving him to us," Jessica whispered through the radio, though Ethan had forgotten he was still holding it. The mother bear sat down heavily, never taking her eyes off her baby, and made a sound that wasn't quite a growl and wasn't quite a whimper. It was something in between, something that transcended species, and spoke directly to the part of Ethan that was not a veterinarian, but simply a living being who understood pain and love. Moving with extreme care, Ethan approached the injured cub. Every instinct told him this was dangerous, that a mother bear would never allow a human this close to her baby, but something deeper told him to trust what was happening. As he knelt beside the small form, he could feel the mother's eyes on him, watching every movement. The cub's breathing was shallow but steady, and up close Ethan could see the wound was serious but not immediately life-threatening if treated quickly. It looked like the cub had fallen onto something sharp, perhaps while climbing or during a panicked escape from something. "Jessica, I need you to very slowly bring the emergency kit from the clinic," Ethan said softly, not wanting to startle anyone, bear or human. "And call Logan Carter from the surgical team. Tell him to prep operating room 2, but tell him we might have an unusual situation." As Jessica moved to comply, Ethan gently examined the cub, aware that its mother was watching his every move with an intensity that was both protective and somehow understanding. The cub stirred slightly under his touch, letting out a weak cry that immediately brought the mother to her feet. But she didn't charge. Instead, she made that same sound again, that mixture of distress and hope, and Ethan found himself speaking to her as if she could understand. "It's okay, Mama. I'm going to help him. Your baby is going to be okay." And the strangest thing was, she seemed to relax slightly at his words, settling back down but remaining vigilant. When Jessica returned with the kit, moving with admirable calm despite the surreal situation, she brought news that added another layer of mystery to the morning. "Ethan, Logan says there's something you should know. The Rangers reported finding blood trails leading here from at least 5 miles deep in the forest. Whatever happened to the cub, she carried him all that way to get here. To get to us specifically." This information sent a chill down Ethan's spine that had nothing to do with the morning cold. 5 miles was an enormous distance for a bear to carry a cub, especially an injured one. It suggested a level of determination and purpose that went beyond simple animal instinct. But more than that, it raised the question of how she knew to come here at all. The sanctuary wasn't visible from the deep forest. There were no clear paths leading to it. Yet she had come directly here, as if she had always known exactly where to find help. As Ethan carefully lifted the small cub, preparing to take him inside for treatment, the mother bear stood again. This time she followed, maintaining that same careful distance but clearly intending to come along. "Ethan, you can't let her into the clinic," Jessica said, though her voice lacked conviction. They both knew that standard procedures had already gone out the window. This was something else entirely, something that demanded a different response. "We'll use the large treatment room," Ethan decided, "the one with the observation window. She can watch from there." It was unprecedented, potentially dangerous, and probably would cost him his license if the wrong people found out. But looking at the mother bear's eyes, seeing the trust she had placed in them by bringing her baby here, Ethan knew there was no other choice. The procession into the clinic was surreal. Ethan carrying the injured cub, Jessica walking beside him with the medical supplies, and behind them a fully grown wild black bear following with careful, measured steps. Logan Carter's face when he saw them enter was a picture of professional composure warring with complete disbelief. "I've prepped everything, but Ethan, are you seriously suggesting we operate with her watching?" "Not just watching," Ethan corrected, gently placing the cub on the examination table. "I think she needs to be there. Look at her, Logan, really look at her. This isn't normal behavior, something's different here." And Logan did look, and what he saw in the bear's eyes made him stop arguing. There was an intelligence there, a purposefulness that couldn't be ignored or explained away. As they prepared for surgery, the mother bear positioned herself at the observation window, standing on her hind legs to better see inside. Her massive paws rested gently against the reinforced glass, and she watched every movement with unwavering attention. When they needed to administer anesthesia to the cub, something extraordinary happened. The mother began making a low, rumbling sound, almost like she was humming, and the cub, who had been restless, immediately calmed. "She's comforting him," Logan breathed, pausing with the syringe in his hand. "She knows we're trying to help, and she's telling him it's okay." The moment was so profound that everyone in the room stopped what they were doing, just for a second, to acknowledge what they were witnessing. This wasn't just an animal seeking help. This was a mother who understood, on some level, what was happening and was actively participating in her child's care. The surgery began with an unusual atmosphere of reverence. Ethan worked with steady hands, cleaning and examining the wound more thoroughly. It was deep but clean, suggesting a single traumatic injury rather than an attack. As he worked, he became aware of a rhythm to the mother's humming, almost like she was singing to her baby through the glass. The sound filled the operating room with an oddly peaceful quality, despite the intensity of the situation. About 30 minutes into the procedure, something happened that would haunt Ethan's dreams for years to come, though not in a frightening way. As he was suturing the deepest part of the wound, the cub's heart rate suddenly spiked on the monitor. Before anyone could react, the mother bear placed both paws flat against the glass and made a different sound, urgent but not aggressive. Ethan looked up and met her eyes, and in that moment he understood. He checked the anesthesia levels and realized the cub was beginning to wake up, something that shouldn't have happened for another hour at least. "More anesthesia, quickly," he told Logan, but the mother bear began shaking her head. It was subtle, but unmistakable. She was shaking her head no, just like a human would. Everyone in the room froze. Did she just? Logan started, but couldn't finish the sentence. It was too impossible, too far outside the realm of what they understood about animal behavior. Ethan made another decision based on instinct rather than training. Instead of adding more anesthesia, he began working faster, speaking softly to the cub as he did. "Just a little more, little one. Your mama's right here. She's watching. You're being so brave." And incredibly, impossibly, the cub's heart rate stabilized. It was as if the mother knew exactly how much her baby could handle, knew that too much anesthesia might be dangerous for such a small body. The rest of the surgery proceeded with this strange cooperation between human medical knowledge and maternal instinct. Whenever the cub showed signs of distress, the mother would make that humming sound, and he would calm. When Ethan needed to reposition the cub for better access to the wound, the mother would shift her position at the window as if to maintain eye contact with her baby. It was a dance of trust and understanding that defied scientific explanation. As Ethan placed the final sutures, he noticed something else unusual. The mother bear had injuries of her own, scratches and cuts on her legs and sides that looked fresh. She had been hurt too, probably in the same incident that injured her cub, but she had ignored her own pain to get her baby to help. The selflessness of it, the pure maternal devotion, was both heartbreaking and inspiring. "Surgery's complete," Ethan announced, though everyone could see that for themselves. "He's going to be fine." The wound was deep but didn't hit any vital organs. With antibiotics and rest, he should make a full recovery. As he said these words, looking directly at the mother bear through the glass, something remarkable happened. She sat back on her haunches, and for just a moment her whole body seemed to relax. The tension she had been carrying, probably for hours or even days, finally released. But then, Logan noticed something that changed everything. "Ethan, we need to sedate her too." Look at her left hind leg. She's been hiding it, but there's significant bleeding." He was right. Now that her baby was safe, the adrenaline that had been keeping the mother going seemed to be wearing off, and she was beginning to favor her injured leg heavily. "We need to treat her," Ethan said, already reaching for new supplies. "Jessica, can you prepare a tranquilizer dose appropriate for her size?" But as Jessica moved to comply, the mother bear did something that stopped them all in their tracks. She stood up, walked to the door of the observation room, and then looked back at her cub. Then she looked at the medical supplies in Ethan's hands, then back at her cub. The message was crystal clear. "She won't let us sedate her," Ethan said slowly, understanding dawning on him. "Not while her cub is still unconscious. She needs to be awake when he wakes up." It was maternal instinct taken to an almost human level of reasoning. She understood that if she was sedated, she couldn't be there for her baby when he woke up scared and confused, and she was willing to endure her own pain to avoid that. The team exchanged glances, each grappling with the implications of what they were witnessing. This wasn't just unusual animal behavior anymore. This was something that challenged their fundamental understanding of animal consciousness and emotional complexity. "We could treat her wounds without full sedation," Logan suggested. "Local anesthetic only, keep her awake but numb the area." And so they prepared for something even more unprecedented than the surgery they had just completed. They were going to perform medical treatment on a fully conscious wild bear, trusting that she understood they were trying to help, trusting that the bond they had somehow formed would hold. As they prepared, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were part of something much larger than a medical emergency. They were witnesses to a kind of communication between species that most people would never believe possible. The mother bear seemed to understand what they were preparing to do. When Jessica approached with the local anesthetic, the bear actually extended her injured leg slightly, making it easier to access. The trust she was showing was profound, especially considering that bears were typically among the most dangerous animals to treat, even when sedated. But nothing about this morning had been typical. As they began cleaning her wounds, the mother kept her eyes fixed on her sleeping cub through the glass partition they had set up. Every few minutes she would make that soft humming sound, as if reassuring him even in his unconscious state that she was still there, still watching over him. The wounds on her legs told a story of their own. They were consistent with a fall through sharp branches or over rocky terrain, suggesting that perhaps both mother and cub had fallen together, and she had used her own body to cushion his fall. "These cuts are at least 12 hours old," Logan observed as he worked. "She's been traveling injured all night to get here." The dedication it must have taken, the pain she must have endured, carrying her injured cub through miles of forest while wounded herself, was almost incomprehensible. Yet here she was, still putting her baby's needs first, refusing sedation that would give her relief because she needed to be present for him. About an hour into treating the mother's wounds, a small miracle occurred. The cub began to stir, making tiny sounds as the anesthesia started to wear off. Immediately, the mother's entire demeanor changed. She stood up, despite Jessica and Logan still working on her legs, and pressed against the partition, making that humming sound but louder now, more insistent. Ethan quickly moved to the cub's side, checking his vitals, making sure everything was normal as he woke up. The moment the cub's eyes opened, bleary and confused, the mother made a sound unlike anything Ethan had ever heard from a bear. It was pure joy mixed with relief, a sound that transcended species and spoke to something universal about the bond between parent and child. The cub responded weakly, trying to lift his head, and the mother pressed harder against the partition, clearly desperate to get to her baby. "We need to let them be together," Ethan said, though every safety protocol screamed against it. look at them. He needs her, and she needs to know he's really okay. It was a risk, bringing an injured cub to a wounded but fully conscious mother bear, but everything about this situation had been about trust, and the trust had not been misplaced yet. They carefully moved the cub, still groggy but alert, to the same room as his mother. The reunion was something that brought tears to everyone's eyes, even Logan, who prided himself on professional detachment. The mother bear, despite her own injuries, immediately began checking her cub over with gentle sniffs and even gentler touches of her massive paws. The cub pressed against her, making small sounds of comfort and recognition. The mother resumed her humming, but it was different now, fuller somehow, like a lullaby of pure contentment. As the team watched this reunion, Jessica suddenly grabbed Ethan's arm. "Look at her neck," she whispered. At first, Ethan didn't see what she meant, but then he noticed it. There, almost hidden in the thick fur around the mother's neck, was something that didn't belong. It was small, weathered, and almost impossible to see unless you were looking for it, but it was definitely artificial. "Is that?" Logan started, moving closer to get a better look without disturbing the reunited family. "It looks like some kind of tag or marker." But it wasn't like any wildlife tag Ethan had ever seen. It was older, more elaborate, and as he looked closer he could see what appeared to be symbols or writing on it, though too worn to make out clearly. This discovery added a new dimension to an already extraordinary morning. This bear wasn't just any wild animal. She had been marked by someone, at some point in her past, for some purpose they could only guess at, and somehow that past had led her here, to them, with a trust in humans that no truly wild bear should possess. The cub was recovering remarkably well, nuzzling against his mother and even attempting to play despite his sutured wound. The mother, for her part, seemed to have forgotten her own pain entirely, focused solely on her baby's comfort and recovery. But Ethan noticed she kept looking at him, meeting his eyes with that same intelligent gaze that had started this whole, incredible experience. "We need to let them rest," Ethan finally said, though he was as reluctant as anyone to leave. "They've both been through trauma, and they need time to recover. We'll monitor them from outside, give them space, but stay close in case they need anything." As the team began to gather their equipment, the mother bear did something that would stay with Ethan forever. She gently nudged her cub to lie down, then looked directly at Ethan and lowered her massive head in what could only be described as a bow of gratitude. The gesture was so deliberate, so clearly meaningful, that nobody spoke for a full minute after witnessing it. They filed out of the treatment room in silence, each processing what they had just experienced in their own way. As Ethan closed the door, he took one last look at the mother and cub, now curled together in a corner of the room, the cub safely tucked against his mother's warm body, both of them finally able to rest. "What do we do now?" Jessica asked once they were all in the hallway. "This isn't, we can't just treat this like a normal wildlife rescue. Something else is happening here." She was right, of course. Everything about this situation suggested a story that went deeper than a simple animal emergency. The marker on the mother's neck, her unusual behavior, her apparent understanding of human medical care, it all pointed to something more. "First, we make sure they both fully recover," Ethan said, his mind already racing with possibilities. "Then we try to understand what that marker means. I have a feeling this mother has a story to tell, if we can figure out how to hear it." He looked through the small window in the ductor at the sleeping bears, mother and cub breathing in synchronized rhythm, and wondered what secrets they carried. As the morning sun finally burned through the mist, casting golden light through the clinic windows, the sanctuary had returned to its normal sounds. Birds were singing again, squirrels chattering in the trees, as if nature itself had relaxed now that the crisis had passed. But for Ethan and his team, nothing would ever be quite normal again. They had witnessed something that challenged everything they thought they knew about the boundaries between human and animal understanding. The mother bear had refused anesthesia until her baby was safe, had shown trust and understanding that seemed impossible, and had revealed that she carried some secret from the past in that mysterious marker. As Ethan sat down to write his report, he found himself struggling to find words that could capture what had really happened. How could he explain the intelligence in her eyes, the deliberate nature of her actions, the profound bond of trust that had formed between species that should be naturally wary of each other? He decided to start with the facts, the medical details that could be verified and measured. But even as he typed, he knew that the real story, the important story, was in the things that couldn't be measured. It was in a mother's love that transcended species, in trust given and received despite every reason not to, in the mystery of consciousness and connection that science was only beginning to understand. The mother bear had brought more than just her injured cub to them that morning. She had brought questions about the nature of intelligence, emotion, and the bonds that connect all living things. Looking through his window, Ethan could see other staff members going about their daily routines, unaware of the miracle that had taken place just yards away. But for those who had witnessed it, for Jessica and Logan and himself, the world had shifted slightly. They had seen something that suggested animals might understand far more than humans gave them credit for, might feel and think and reason in ways that science was only beginning to explore. The mother bear's refusal of anesthesia wasn't just a medical anomaly. It was a window into a different kind of consciousness, one that prioritized love over comfort, duty over relief. It was a reminder that the natural world was full of mysteries that humans had barely begun to uncover. And somewhere in that mystery, in the worn marker around the mother's neck and the knowing look in her eyes, was a story waiting to be discovered. As the day wore on and the bears continued to rest peacefully, Ethan found himself checking on them frequently, drawn by something he couldn't quite name. Each time, the mother would open one eye, check that her cub was still safely beside her, then look at Ethan with that same steady gaze. It was as if she was saying, "Thank you," over and over, in the only way she could, but more than that, it was as if she was waiting for something, as if bringing her cub here for medical treatment was only the first part of a larger purpose. The mystery of the marker gnawed at Ethan's mind. Who had placed it there? When? And why? Was this bear part of some old research project? Had she been raised by humans and then released? Or was there some other explanation, something even more extraordinary? The questions multiplied with each passing hour, but the answers remained frustratingly out of reach. As his shift neared its end, Ethan made one more visit to the recovery room. The cub was awake now, playfully pawing at his mother's face while she tolerantly endured his attention. The surgical site looked good, no signs of infection or complications. The mother's wounds also appeared to be healing well, though she would need several more days of treatment. But it was clear that both bears were going to make full recoveries, at least physically. The emotional and psychological dimensions of what had happened were harder to assess. How would this experience affect them? Would the mother's trust in humans extend beyond this emergency? Would the cub grow up with a different understanding of the relationship between bears and people? These were questions that might never be answered, but they were important to consider. As Ethan watched them, the mother suddenly stood up and walked to the door where he was standing. She pressed her nose against the small window and looked at him with those impossibly intelligent eyes. Then she did something that made his breath catch. She raised one paw and placed it flat against the door, right where his hand was resting on the other side. For a moment they stayed like that, two different species connected by nothing more than a thin piece of wood and glass, yet understanding each other perfectly. It was a moment of pure connection, the kind that transcended language and logic. In that moment, Ethan understood that whatever had brought this bear to them, whatever story that marker told, it was part of something larger than just one mother and her cub. It was about the possibility of understanding between species, about the bridges that could be built when fear was replaced with trust, when assumptions were challenged by experience. The mother bear held his gaze for another long moment, then returned to her cub, settling down beside him with a contented sigh. Ethan stood there for a while longer, his hand still pressed against the door where her paw had been, feeling like he had just been given a gift he didn't fully understand, but would treasure forever. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. They would need to decide how long to keep the bears, when it would be safe to release them, and whether the mother's unusual behavior meant she needed special consideration. They would need to investigate the marker, try to trace its origins and understand its significance. And they would need to document everything. Create a record of this extraordinary event that might help other scientists understand the true capabilities of animal consciousness. But tonight, as the sun set over Pine Ridge Wildlife Sanctuary and cast long shadows through the trees, there was peace. A mother and her cub were safe and healing, surrounded by humans who had proven themselves worthy of an almost impossible trust. The questions could wait until tomorrow. For now, it was enough to know that sometimes, in the quiet spaces between human and wild, miracles could happen. The sanctuary settled into its evening routine, but in one room, a mother bear hummed softly to her sleeping cub, a lullaby that spoke of journeys through dark forests, of pain endured for love, and of help found in the most unexpected places. And in his office, writing reports that could never fully capture what had happened, Ethan Marshall listened to that humming and knew that his life had been changed forever by a bear who had refused anesthesia until her baby was safe. Chapter 2. The Unspoken Agreement. The operating room had never felt smaller than it did now. With the massive mother bear standing at the observation window, her dark eyes tracking every movement of Ethan's hands as he prepared for the most unusual surgery of his career. The cub lay still on the operating table, his small chest rising and falling steadily under the influence of carefully measured anesthesia, while his mother watched with an intensity that seemed to fill the entire room despite the barrier between them. Logan Carter had dimmed the overhead light slightly, leaving just the surgical lamp illuminating their work area. And in that focused circle of light, something extraordinary was about to unfold. Ethan had performed hundreds of surgeries on wild animals over his 15 years at Pine Ridge Wildlife Sanctuary, but never with an audience like this. Never with a fully conscious mother bear just feet away, separated only by reinforced glass and an understanding that defied everything he knew about animal behavior. Her presence changed everything about the atmosphere in the room. It wasn't threatening exactly, but it was powerful, like standing next to a force of nature that had chosen, for reasons unknown, to trust them with something precious beyond measure. As he made the first incision to properly clean and examine the wound, the mother bear shifted slightly, and everyone in the room tensed, but she wasn't showing aggression. Instead, she had simply adjusted her position to get a better view, standing fully on her hind legs now, her massive frame filling the entire window. Her paws rested gently against the glass, and Ethan could see the worn pads, the small scars that told stories of years lived in the wild, of territories crossed and challenges faced. Yet here she stood, calm and watching, trusting them with her most precious possession. "Vitals are stable," Logan reported quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might break whatever spell had allowed this impossible situation to exist. Heart rate is actually lower than normal for a cub under anesthesia. It's like he knows he's safe. The observation sent a small shiver through Ethan. How could an unconscious cub know anything? Yet the monitors didn't lie, and the steady beep of the heart monitor created an almost meditative rhythm in the room. As Ethan worked to clean the wound, he became aware of that humming sound again, the one the mother had started making earlier. It was so low it was almost below the range of human hearing, more of a vibration than a sound, and it seemed to sync with the beeping of the heart monitor. Jessica, who was assisting, noticed it too. "She's matching his heartbeat," she breathed, her eyes wide with wonder. "Listen, every time the monitor beeps, she hums. She's keeping rhythm with him." It was true, and once they noticed it, it became impossible to ignore. The mother bear was somehow synchronizing her humming with her cub's heartbeat, creating a connection that transcended the physical barrier between them. It was as if she was holding him, comforting him, even though she couldn't touch him. The dedication, the love, the sheer impossibility of it all made Ethan's hands pause for just a moment before he continued his work with renewed determination. The wound was worse than it had initially appeared. Whatever had caused it, likely a sharp branch or rock during what must have been a traumatic fall, had gone deep into the muscle tissue. But miraculously, it had missed all the vital organs and major blood vessels. As Ethan carefully explored the extent of the damage, he found himself talking, not to Logan or Jessica, but to the mother bear watching through the glass. "He's lucky," he said softly. "Another inch to the left and it would have been much worse. You did good, Mama. You got him here in time." The mother bear's ears twitched at his words, and she made a soft chuffing sound that seemed almost like acknowledgement. Logan and Jessica exchanged glances over Ethan's head, both thinking the same thing, but neither quite ready to voice it. This bear understood them. Not just their intentions, but their actual words. It should have been impossible, but the evidence was right there in front of them, undeniable and profound. As Ethan began the delicate process of suturing the internal damage, something extraordinary happened. The cub's breathing hitched slightly, a normal response even under anesthesia, but before anyone could adjust the medication, the mother bear did something that stopped them all sea cold. She lifted one paw and tapped against the glass. 3 deliberate taps, then pointed with her snout toward the IV line. The message was clear, even if the method of communication was unprecedented. She was asking about the medication, showing concern about the change in her cub's breathing. "It's okay," Ethan found himself explaining, to her, as if she was another concerned parent in a human hospital. "This is normal. His body is just adjusting, see? His breathing is already steadying out." And indeed it was, the little chest returning to its regular rhythm. The mother bear studied the monitors, her eyes tracking from the IV to the heart monitor to her cub, then back to Ethan. Then, seemingly satisfied with his explanation, she resumed her position and continued her rhythmic humming. The surgery continued with this strange dance of communication and trust. Every time something changed, the mother would notice, sometimes before the humans did. When Ethan needed to reposition the cub to better access the wound, the mother would shift her own position to maintain visual contact with her baby's face. When the heart rate increased slightly as Ethan worked on a particularly sensitive area, the mother's humming would intensify, and remarkably the heart rate would stabilize. About 40 minutes into the procedure, Logan noticed something odd on the monitors. "Ethan, look at this," he said, pointing to the brain activity readout they had attached as a precaution. The cub's showing unusual patterns for an animal under anesthesia. "It's like he's dreaming," but the patterns are too organized for normal REM sleep. Ethan studied the readout, and what he saw made him glance up at the mother bear. The patterns seemed to pulse in time with her humming, as if somehow, impossibly, she was influencing her cub's brain activity through sound alone. "There have been studies," Jessica said quietly, "about how certain animals can communicate through infrasound, sounds below human hearing. Elephants do it over vast distances, but I've never heard of bears having this ability, and certainly not to this degree." Yet the evidence was right there in front of them, documented on their machines, recorded for posterity. This mother was somehow reaching her unconscious cub, keeping him calm and stable through methods science hadn't yet discovered or understood. As Ethan worked on the final internal sutures, he became aware that the mother had stopped humming. Looking up, he saw her staring intently at his hands, her head tilted slightly as if she was trying to understand what he was doing. On impulse, he began narrating his actions. "I'm using dissolvable sutures here," he explained to her. "They'll hold everything in place while he heals, then disappear on their own. He won't even know they're there." The bear's eyes followed his hands with an intensity that suggested she was actually trying to understand, to learn what was being done to help her baby. Then came the moment that would be burned into everyone's memory forever. As Ethan prepared to close the external wound, the cub's body tensed slightly, an involuntary muscle reaction that sometimes happened during surgery. Before anyone could react, the mother bear made a series of quick, deliberate movements. She pressed both paws against the glass, then moved them in a pattern that looked almost like she was showing them something. "Wait," Logan said suddenly. "Look at what she's doing. She's showing us where he's hurt. Look, she's touching the glass exactly where his other injuries are, the minor ones we haven't examined yet." It was true. The mother bear was systematically pointing out every scratch, every bruise on her cub's body, making sure they saw everything that needed attention. She had been watching them work and understood that they were healing her baby, and now she was trying to help by showing them what they might have missed. Ethan carefully examined the areas the mother had indicated and found she was right. There were several smaller wounds hidden under the cub's thick fur that they hadn't noticed in their focus on the major injury. None were serious, but they all needed cleaning and care to prevent infection. "Thank you," he said to the mother, meaning it with every fiber of his being. "We'll take care of all of it. Every single hurt." The mother bear settled back on her haunches, apparently satisfied that her message had been understood. The rest of the surgery proceeded with this remarkable cooperation between species. The mother would alert them to changes in her cub's condition, sometimes before the monitors registered them. She seemed to have an almost supernatural awareness of her baby's state, knowing when he was comfortable and when he was experiencing any distress, even while unconscious. And through it all, that low humming continued, a constant thread of maternal comfort that seemed to wrap around the cub like an invisible blanket. As Ethan placed the final external sutures, working with extra care to minimize scarring on the young bear's body, he noticed tears on Jessica's face. She wasn't trying to hide them, wasn't embarrassed by them. They were tears of wonder, of witnessing something that challenged everything they thought they knew about the boundaries between human and animal consciousness. Logan, usually so clinical and detached, had a suspicious brightness in his eyes as well. "That's the last suture," Ethan announced, though everyone could see the surgery was complete. "He did beautifully. The wound is closed. All the smaller injuries are cleaned and treated. Now, he just needs time to heal." As he spoke, he looked directly at the mother bear, making sure she understood that her baby was going to be okay. The relief that washed over her features was unmistakable. Her whole body sagged slightly, the tension she had been holding for who knew how long finally releasing. But then she did something that made everyone gasp. She stood up fully on her hind legs and placed both paws against the glass, and then she looked at each human in the room in turn. First Ethan, then Logan, then Jessica. It was deliberate, purposeful, and the message was clear. She was thanking each of them individually, acknowledging their role in saving her cub. It was a gesture so human, so conscious and deliberate, that it left no room for doubt about the level of awareness they were dealing with. "We need to move him to recovery," Logan said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "And we need to figure out how to reunite them safely." This was the part they had all been dreading. How did you reunite a wounded cub with a fully conscious, understandably emotional mother bear? Every protocol said it was too dangerous, but everything about this situation had already shattered protocols. The mother seemed to understand their dilemma. She backed away from the glass and sat down, her posture calm and patient. She was giving them space, showing them she understood they needed to move her baby and that she would wait. The trust she was displaying was extraordinary, especially considering that maternal bears were known to be among the most dangerous animals when their cubs were threatened. Yet here she was, deliberately showing them she would not be a threat. They moved the cub carefully to the recovery room, the same one where the mother had been waiting. As they entered with the small, still form, the mother's control almost broke. She started to rise, every instinct telling her to rush to her baby, but then she stopped herself, looking at Ethan as if asking permission. "It's okay," he said softly. "Go to him." Gently, but go to him. And she did, moving with a grace that belied her size, approaching her unconscious cub with infinite tenderness. What happened next was one of the most beautiful things any of them had ever witnessed. The mother bear began examining her cub with incredible gentleness, sniffing each sutured wound, each cleaned scratch. She was checking their work, verifying that everything had been taken care of, but she was doing it with such care not to disturb the healing injuries. When she was satisfied, she carefully lay down next to him, positioning herself so that her body curved around his, providing warmth and protection without putting any pressure on his wounded side. Then she began grooming him, her large tongue carefully cleaning his face and ears, avoiding all the treated areas with remarkable precision. It was a normal maternal behavior, but in this context it seemed to carry extra meaning. She was reclaiming him, marking him as hers again, after allowing strangers to care for him. But she was also being incredibly careful not to disturb any of the medical work that had been done. She understood, somehow, that the sutures and bandages were helping him heal. As the team watched this reunion, Jessica suddenly grabbed Ethan's arm and pointed. The mysterious marker on the mother's neck was more visible now as she groomed her cub, and in the better light of the recovery room, they could make out more details. It wasn't just a tag. It looked like some kind of medallion or pendant, very old and worn, with symbols that might have been letters or numbers once but were now too faded to read clearly. But there was something else, something that made Ethan's heart skip a beat. There was a small symbol that was still visible, and it looked familiar somehow. "I've seen that symbol before," Logan said slowly, his eyes fixed on the marker. "Not exactly the same, but similar." It was in an old journal in the sanctuary's archives. Something about a research project from decades ago, something about animal intelligence and communication. The implications of this hung heavy in the air. This bear might be connected to something larger, some piece of scientific history that had been lost or forgotten. But those were questions for later. Right now, they were witnessing something more immediate and profound. The cub was beginning to stir, the anesthesia wearing off more quickly than expected, The mother noticed immediately, her grooming becoming more focused on his face, and that humming started again, louder now that there was no barrier between them. The cub's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and confused at first, but then they found his mother's face, and he made a small sound of recognition and relief. The mother's response was to intensify her grooming, all while making soft chuffing sounds that seemed to be bear language for, "You're safe, you're okay, I'm here." The cub tried to move, then whimpered as the movement pulled at his sutures. Immediately, the mother placed a gentle but firm paw on him, holding him still while continuing to comfort him with sounds and gentle licks. She was being a perfect patient advocate, keeping him calm and still while he recovered. Ethan and his team retreated to the doorway, giving the bears some privacy while still observing to make sure there were no complications. The cub was recovering remarkably well, his vital signs strong and stable. The mother had positioned herself so he could nurse if he wanted to, but she wasn't forcing it, seeming to understand that he might not be ready for that yet. Her patience and understanding were remarkable. "We should test her," Jessica said suddenly. "Not in an invasive way, but just see how much she really understands. If she's connected to some old research project, if she has this level of intelligence, we need to document it." Ethan was torn. Part of him wanted to protect this bear's privacy, to let her secret remain secret. But another part, the scientist in him, knew Jessica was right. This could be a breakthrough in understanding animal consciousness. Tomorrow, he decided. Let them rest tonight. Tomorrow, we can try some simple communication tests, see if she responds, but only if she's willing. We don't force anything. The others agreed, and they began to quietly gather their equipment, preparing to leave the bears in peace. But as they moved to go, the mother bear did something that stopped them one more time. She carefully extracted herself from her cub, who was now sleeping peacefully, and walked over to where they stood. She sat down in front of them, and then did something unprecedented. She held out her injured leg, the one they had treated but hadn't been able to fully examine because she had refused sedation. She was asking for help, now that her cub was safe and sleeping. She was finally ready to let them care for her own wounds. "She waited," Logan said, his voice full of awe. "She endured the pain this whole time because her cub came first, and now she's asking for help." It was a level of reasoning and prioritization that was supposed to be uniquely human. Yet here was proof that maternal love and sacrifice transcended species in ways science was only beginning to understand. They treated her wounds right there, with her fully conscious and cooperative. She didn't flinch, didn't growl, didn't show any sign of aggression even when the cleaning solution must have stung terribly. She just sat there, occasionally glancing back at her sleeping cub to make sure he was still okay, but otherwise completely trusting them to help her. The wounds were worse than they had initially thought, deep punctures and lacerations that must have been agonizing to walk on, let alone carry a cub for miles through the forest. As they worked, Ethan found himself studying the marker more closely. It was definitely old, possibly several decades, and it was attached with a collar that had long since grown into her fur, becoming part of her. Whatever had put it there had intended it to be permanent. The symbols were tantalizingly familiar, but just unclear enough to be frustrating. He made a mental note to research the sanctuary's archives as soon as possible. When they finished treating her wounds, wrapping them in bandages that she examined with interest but didn't try to remove, the mother bear did something that would stay with them forever. She stood up, walked to each human in turn, and gently touched them with her nose. It wasn't a sniff or an investigation. It was a deliberate touch, a thank you that needed no translation. Then she returned to her cub, curling around him once more, and looked back at them with those incredible eyes. "We'll check on you every hour," Ethan promised her. "Both of you. And tomorrow, when you're both stronger, we'll figure out the next steps together." The bear seemed to understand, settling in with a contented sigh, her body relaxed but alert, ready to protect her cub if needed, but trusting them enough to rest. As they finally left the recovery room, closing the door quietly behind them, the weight of what they had witnessed settled over them like a heavy blanket. They had just participated in something that challenged fundamental assumptions about animal intelligence, consciousness, and the possibility of communication between species. The mother bear had shown reasoning, planning, emotional complexity, and, most remarkably, trust in humans that suggested a history they could only guess at. "What do we do with this?" Jessica asked, voicing what they were all thinking. "I mean, we have to report it, document it, but who's going to believe us? A bear that understands surgery, that can communicate complex ideas, that refuses anesthesia for logical reasons. The evidence was all there, recorded on video and in medical charts, but it still seemed too extraordinary to be real." "We start with the facts," Ethan said, though he knew facts alone couldn't capture what had really happened. "We document everything meticulously. And we try to find out about that marker, about any research projects that might explain her behavior. Someone, somewhere, knows something about this bear." But even as he said it, he wondered if they were ready for whatever truth they might uncover. The sanctuary had returned to its evening quiet, other animals settling for the night, unaware of the miracle that had taken place in their midst. But in the recovery room, a mother bear hummed softly to her sleeping cub, a sound that spoke of love that transcended species, of trust given and received, of connections that science was only beginning to understand. The surgery was over, but the mystery was just beginning. As Ethan sat in his office later that night, trying to write a report that could somehow capture the day's events, he kept thinking about that moment when the mother had pointed out her cub's other injuries. She had understood not just that they were helping, but how they were helping. She had grasped the concept of medical treatment and had actively participated in her cub's care. It suggested a level of cognitive ability that should have been impossible for a bear. But then again, he thought as he looked out at the darkening forest, maybe humans had been wrong about what was possible all along. Maybe consciousness and intelligence existed on a spectrum far broader than science had assumed. Maybe the boundaries between human and animal awareness were more fluid than anyone had imagined. The mother bear had shown them something profound today, something that would change how they thought about animal consciousness forever. The cub would heal. Of that Ethan was certain. The surgery had been successful, and with his mother's constant care he would recover fully. But what would happen after that? Could they release bears who had shown such remarkable trust and intelligence back into the wild? Or did they have a responsibility to protect them, to learn from them? These were questions that would need answers, but not tonight. Tonight, it was enough to know that a mother's love had transcended species barriers, that trust had been given and honored, and that in a small wildlife sanctuary in Pine Ridge, something extraordinary had happened. The mother bear had refused anesthesia until her baby was safe, and in doing so, had opened a window into possibilities that humans were only beginning to glimpse. As the moon rose over the sanctuary, casting silver light through the windows of the recovery room, the mother bear continued her vigil. Her cub slept, peacefully, his small body warm against hers, his breathing steady and strong. The sutures would hold, the wounds would heal, and soon he would be running and playing again. But something had changed in the relationship between these bears and the humans who had saved them. Something that could never be undone. The unspoken agreement between them, born of desperation and trust, had created a bond that transcended the normal boundaries of wild and tame, animal and human. It was a reminder that the world was full of mysteries still waiting to be discovered, full of connections that science had yet to understand. And in a small recovery room in Pine Ridge Wildlife Sanctuary, a mother bear and her cub were living proof that sometimes the most profound truths came not from textbooks or laboratories, but from moments of pure connection between living beings who chose to trust each other despite every reason not to. The morning after the surgery dawned crisp and clear, with golden sunlight filtering through the recovery room windows where the mother bear and her cub had spent their first peaceful night in safety. Avery Johnson, the sanctuary's wildlife biologist, arrived early, having heard about the extraordinary events of the previous day through a series of increasingly incredulous phone calls from Jessica. As someone who had dedicated her life to studying animal behavior, Avery thought she had seen everything the natural world had to offer. But the scene that greeted her through the observation window challenged every assumption she had ever made about the limits of animal consciousness. The mother bear was awake, sitting upright with her cub nestled between her front paws, and she was doing something that made Avery's breath catch in her throat. She was examining the sutures on her cub's side with what could only be described as methodical precision, not licking or disturbing them, but simply observing, as if checking that everything was healing properly. When she noticed Avery watching, she didn't startle or show aggression. Instead, she made eye contact and held it, and in that gaze was an intelligence that seemed almost human in its depth and complexity. Ethan joined Avery at the window, having spent most of the night researching the sanctuary's archives for any mention of research projects involving bears. His eyes were tired but bright with excitement as he showed her what he had found. "There was something," he said quietly, not wanting to disturb the bears even though they couldn't hear through the soundproof glass. Back in the 1970s, there was a project here at Pine Ridge, something about studying advanced cognition in various species, but most of the records were destroyed in a fire in 1985. All I could find were fragments, references to something called Project Echo. Avery studied the photocopied pages Ethan had found, faded and partially illegible, but what she could read made her pulse quicken. The project had apparently involved raising certain animals from birth with intensive human interaction, not to tame them, but to see if they could develop enhanced communication abilities while maintaining their wild instincts. Bears had been mentioned specifically, along with something about markers to identify the subjects if they were ever encountered again after release. "We need to get a closer look at that marker," Avery said, her scientific curiosity fully engaged now. If this bear is connected to Project Echo, she could be second or even third generation. The enhanced cognition could have been passed down, maybe even strengthened over generations. The implications were staggering. If true, they weren't just dealing with one exceptional bear, but potentially evidence of evolution accelerated by human intervention, creating a bloodline of bears with cognitive abilities far beyond what nature alone would have produced. They entered the recovery room slowly, announcing themselves with soft voices to avoid startling either bear. The mother watched them approach, but her body language remained calm, almost welcoming. The cub was awake now, too, alert but still weak from his ordeal, pressing close to his mother's warm bulk. Avery approached with the careful respect one would show to any intelligent being, human or otherwise, and the mother seemed to appreciate this, allowing her to come close enough to examine the marker. What Avery saw made her hands tremble slightly as she took photographs with her phone. The marker was indeed old, the metal tarnished and worn, but now that she was close, she could make out more details. There was a serial number, barely visible, but definitely there. and below it the symbol Ethan had noticed, which she now recognized as a stylized echo wave, the logo of Project Echo. But there was something else, something that made her gasp softly. Etched in tiny letters around the edge were words, a message perhaps, though most were too worn to read. But she could make out fragments: understanding beyond, and bridge between worlds. The mother bear seemed to understand that Avery was interested in the marker. In an extraordinary display of cooperation, she actually tilted her head to give Avery a better angle for her photographs, holding perfectly still while the biologist documented every detail she could capture. It was as if she wanted them to know, wanted them to understand whatever story the marker held. The trust she was showing, allowing a stranger so close to her and her injured cub, spoke volumes about her past experiences with humans. As Avery worked, she became aware that the mother was watching her with intense focus, not with the wariness of a wild animal, but with what seemed like recognition. "Have you seen other humans before?" Avery found herself asking, speaking as naturally as if the bear could answer. "Others who wore clothes like mine, who studied you or your parents." The bear's response was to reach out slowly, so slowly it couldn't be interpreted as aggression, and gently touch the sanctuary logo on Avery's jacket with one massive paw. The touch was deliberate and specific, and when Avery looked down at where the bear had touched, she noticed something she hadn't before. The sanctuary logo had changed over the years, but the version on her jacket, which she had gotten from a vintage shop, was the old one from the 1970s and 80s. It was the same logo that would have been worn by the researchers from Project Echo. The bear recognized it, which meant she had either seen it before or had been taught to recognize it by someone who had. "Your mother," Avery breathed, the pieces starting to come together in her mind. "Your mother was part of Project Echo, wasn't she? And she taught you about humans, about this place. That's why you knew to come here when your baby was hurt." The bear's eyes seemed to brighten at this, and she made a soft sound that wasn't quite a growl, more like an acknowledgement. It was impossible, it should have been impossible, but the evidence was mounting that this bear had been raised with stories, memories, perhaps even instructions passed down from a mother who had known humans intimately. Ethan had been checking on the cub while Avery examined the marker, and he made an observation that added another layer to the mystery. "The cub's responses are unusual too," he said quietly. "When I examine him, he doesn't show typical fear responses. He's cautious, but not frightened. It's like he's been prepared for human interaction, even though he's probably never seen a human before yesterday." This suggested that whatever enhanced cognition the mother possessed, she had somehow been able to communicate complex concepts to her offspring, preparing him for possibilities he had never experienced. The examination revealed that both bears were healing remarkably well. The cub's sutures were holding perfectly, with no signs of infection or complications. The mother's wounds were also healing faster than expected, and she had not disturbed any of the bandages, seeming to understand their purpose. But it was their behavior that continued to astound everyone who observed them. They were calm, cooperative, and showed none of the stress signals typically seen in wild animals in captivity. As the day progressed, more pieces of the puzzle began to emerge. Logan had been doing his own research and had found something remarkable in the local newspaper archives. There had been reports, going back decades, of unusual bear sightings in the Pine Ridge area. Bears that seemed to watch humans with unusual interest, that avoided conflicts even when threatened, that displayed problem-solving abilities that seemed beyond normal ursine intelligence. The reports had been dismissed as exaggeration or misidentification, but now they took on new significance. There could be a whole population of them, Logan said, showing Avery and Ethan the articles he had printed. Descendants of the Project Echo bears living in the deep forest, passing down enhanced intelligence through generations. This mother and cub might not be unique. They might be part of something much larger. The thought was both exciting and sobering. If true, it raised ethical questions about human responsibility for these enhanced beings, about their rights and protections, about what it meant to be intelligent in ways that transcended species boundaries. The mother bear seemed to sense their growing understanding. As they discussed their findings, she would occasionally make sounds or movements that seemed timed to their conversation, as if she was participating in her own way. When Avery mentioned the possibility of others like her, the mother stood and went to the window, looking out toward the forest with what could only be described as longing. She had family out there, others of her kind, and the separation was clearly weighing on her. But she wouldn't leave, not yet. Her cub still needed care, still needed the safety and medical attention the sanctuary could provide. So she stayed, this remarkable creature caught between two worlds, wild yet understanding of human ways, fierce yet gentle, independent yet capable of trust. She was a living bridge between the human and animal worlds, proof that the boundaries between species were far more permeable than anyone had imagined. As Avery continued her observations, she noticed something else extraordinary. The mother was teaching her cub not just normal bear behaviors, but something more complex. She would touch various objects in the room, then look at her cub, then touch them again. It took Avery a while to realize what was happening, but when she did, it took her breath away. The mother was naming things, creating associations between objects and specific sounds she made. She was teaching her cub a rudimentary language, a way to categorize and communicate about the world around them. "This is unprecedented," Avery whispered to Ethan, her voice shaking with excitement. "She's not just intelligent, she's cultural. She's passing down knowledge, creating systematic ways to share information. This is the kind of behavior we see in great apes, in dolphins, but never in bears." Project Echo didn't just enhance their intelligence. It gave them the capacity for culture, for accumulated knowledge passed between generations. The implications were staggering. If the Project Echo bears had developed their own culture, their own ways of understanding and communicating about the world, then they were not just smart animals. They were something new, something that challenged the very definition of what it meant to be a sentient species. And the mother bear seemed to understand the significance of what she was revealing, deliberately showing them these behaviors as if she wanted them to know, wanted them to understand what she and her kind had become. As the afternoon wore on, Avery made another discovery that changed everything. While reviewing the photographs she had taken of the marker, enhancing them with software on her laptop, she managed to decipher more of the worn text around the edge. The full message, as far as she could reconstruct it, read, "For understanding beyond species, for the bridge between worlds may you find your way home." But it was the last part, barely visible even with enhancement that made her gasp. There was a name, Dr. Sarah Chen, Project Echo, 1978. Avery's fingers flew over her keyboard as she searched for information about Dr. Sarah Chen. What she found was the obituary from 2010, describing a wildlife biologist who had dedicated her life to studying animal intelligence after working on a classified government project in her youth. But more interesting were the comments on the online memorial page. Several mentioned her stories about bears she had worked with, bears she claimed could understand human speech, bears she had loved like family and had never forgotten. One comment in particular stood out, posted by someone identified only as MC, Sarah never stopped believing they would come back. She said she left markers so they could find their way home if they ever needed help. She would be so happy to know her faith was justified. The comment was dated just a year ago, suggesting that someone who had known Dr. Chen and Project Echo was still alive, still remembering. Avery showed the information to Ethan and Logan, and they all turned to look at the mother bear, who was grooming her cub with infinite gentleness. She found her way home, Ethan said softly. Just like Doctor? Chen hoped she would. When her baby was hurt, she remembered the stories, the promise of help, and she found her way here. It was a fulfillment of a promise made decades ago, a testament to memory and trust passed down through generations. The mother bear seemed to sense their emotional response to these discoveries. She stopped grooming her cub and looked at them directly, and then she did something none of them would ever forget. She stood up on her hind legs and placed one paw over her heart, then extended it toward them. It was a gesture so human, so deliberate and meaningful, that it transcended any need for verbal communication. She was acknowledging the connection, the bridge between their kinds that Dr. Chen had hoped to build all those years ago. As evening approached, they faced a decision. The cub was healing well, but would need several more days of observation and care. The mother, despite her own injuries, was clearly capable of surviving in the wild, but releasing them raised questions. Should they try to find the others, the rest of the Project Echo descendants? Should they protect the secret of their existence or share it with the world? And most importantly, what did the bears themselves want? The answer came from an unexpected source. As they discussed these questions in the recovery room, speaking freely in front of the bears, as had become their habit, the mother suddenly stood and walked to the door. She didn't try to open it or show any signs of wanting to leave. Instead, she sat down facing it and made a series of distinct sounds, different from anything they had heard from her before. Then she repeated them, looking at Avery as she did so. She's trying to tell us something specific, Avery said, pulling out her phone to record the sounds. The mother repeated them again, patient as a teacher with slow students. Then she went to the window and pointed toward the forest, then back to herself and her cub, then made the sounds again. The pattern continued until suddenly, Avery understood. She's telling us about the others. Those sounds, their names or calls. She's telling us her family is out there. The mother seemed pleased that they were beginning to understand. She continued her demonstration, using different sounds while pointing in different directions, building a map of sorts of where others might be found. It was clear she wanted them to know, wanted them to understand that she and her cub were not alone, that there was a whole community of enhanced bears living secretly in the deep forests around Pine Ridge. But she also made it clear, through gestures and behaviors that were becoming easier to interpret, that this knowledge came with responsibility. She would trust them with this secret because they had saved her cub, but the trust had conditions. When she and her cub were healed, they would return to the forest. The sanctuary would be a place of refuge if needed, but the bears would remain wild, living their own lives, developing their own culture away from human interference. It was a negotiation of sorts, conducted without words but with perfect understanding on both sides. The humans would keep the secret of the Project Echo bears, would be there if medical help was needed, but would not seek them out or disturb their hidden society. In return, the bears would know they had allies in the human world, a safe harbor in times of crisis, a bridge between worlds that could be crossed when necessary, but would otherwise remain respectfully separate. As night fell, Avery made one more discovery that tied everything together. In Dr. Chen's obituary, there was mention of a daughter, Melody Chen, living in the nearby town of Riverside. MC, the commenter on the memorial page. Without hesitation, Avery called the number she found in the phone directory, and when a woman answered, she simply said, "I'm calling about Project Echo." One of them came home. The silence on the other end was long, but when Melody Chen finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "My mother waited her whole life for this call. She never stopped believing they would remember, that the bond would hold across generations. Is the bear all right?" Avery assured her that both mother and cub were doing well, and Melody promised to come first thing in the morning, bringing with her what remained of her mother's research, the full story of Project Echo that had never been told. That night, as Ethan made his final rounds, he found the mother bear still awake, sitting by the window and looking out at the stars. Her cub was sleeping peacefully, curled up in a nest of blankets the bears had arranged themselves. The mother turned to look at him as he approached, and in her eyes was something that looked very much like contemplation, as if she too was processing the momentous events of the past 2 days. "Your secret is safe," Ethan told her quietly, knowing she would understand the intent if not the words. "Dr. Chen's daughter is coming tomorrow. She'll have answers, stories about your mother or grandmother, about where you came from. But whatever we learn, whatever we discover, we'll respect what you've shown us. The bridge between our worlds will remain, but you choose when to cross it." The mother bear listened, her head tilted slightly, then she did something that would stay with Ethan forever. She yawned, a perfectly normal bear behavior, but then she deliberately lay down in what was clearly a sleeping position, closing her eyes with exaggerated slowness. She was telling him, in the clearest way she could, that she understood and trusted them enough to sleep peacefully. The conversation was over for tonight, but the connection would remain. The next morning brought Melody Chen, a woman in her 60s with her mother's eyes, and a box of carefully preserved documents and photographs. When she saw the mother bear through the observation window, tears streamed down her face. "She looks just like Luna," she whispered, "my mother's favorite, the smartest of them all. This must be her daughter or granddaughter." The mother bear seemed to recognize something in Melody too, coming to the glass and placing her paw against it, right where Melody had placed her hand. The documents Melody brought filled in the gaps in the story. Project Echo had been a military-funded project initially, aimed at creating animals that could be used for reconnaissance or rescue operations. But Dr. Chen and her team had discovered something unexpected. The enhanced intelligence they were fostering couldn't be controlled or directed towards specific purposes. Instead, it developed organically, creating beings that were neither fully wild nor fully domesticated, but something entirely new. When the military lost interest, Dr. Chen had fought to protect the bears, eventually convincing the authorities to release them into the protected forests around Pine Ridge. But she had done more than just release them. She had prepared them, teaching them about humans, about the sanctuary, about how to seek help if needed. She had given them the markers, not as tracking devices but as promises, symbols of a covenant between species that would honor both their wildness and their enhanced nature. She always said they would develop their own culture, Melody explained, watching as the mother bear demonstrated more of her teaching behaviors with her cub. She believed they would become something unprecedented, a parallel society that could teach us about the nature of intelligence itself. But she also knew they needed to be free to develop on their own terms, without human interference. The sanctuary was meant to be their safety net, not their cage. The records showed that 12 bears had been released initially, 6 mated pairs of varying ages. If they had survived and reproduced, there could be dozens of enhanced bears now living in the forests, maybe more. Each generation would potentially be more sophisticated than the last, building on the foundation of enhanced cognition and cultural transmission that Project Echo had initiated. The mother bear they were treating could be third or even fourth generation, carrying forward a legacy of intelligence that was both human-initiated and uniquely ursine. As Melody shared these revelations, the mother bear did something extraordinary. She began making marks on the floor with her claw, deliberate scratches that formed patterns. At first, they seemed random, but then Melody gasped. "Those are the teaching symbols my mother used. She's showing us she knows them, that they've been passed down." The bear was demonstrating that Dr. Chen's educational methods had become part of their cultural heritage, preserved and transmitted across generations. The implications were staggering. The Project Echo Bears weren't just intelligent individuals. They were a culture, a society with its own transmitted knowledge, its own ways of understanding and interacting with the world. They had taken what humans had given them and made it their own, creating something that transcended both human and bear nature. They were living proof that intelligence and culture were not uniquely human traits, but could emerge wherever the cognitive capacity existed to support them. The cub was recovering remarkably well, already trying to play despite his injuries, and the mother's wounds were healing cleanly. Soon they would be ready to return to the forest, to their hidden society that humans had initiated but no longer controlled. But the connection that had been forged during this crisis would remain. The sanctuary would always be here for them, a place of refuge when needed, and the humans who had witnessed this miracle would carry the secret and the responsibility of knowing that humanity shared the world with another intelligent culture. On the fourth day after the surgery, Avery made another breakthrough. By analyzing the sounds the mother had been making and comparing them to recordings of normal bear vocalizations, she discovered that the Project Echo Bears had developed a rudimentary but consistent language. It wasn't as complex as human language, but it had structure, repeatability, and the ability to convey abstract concepts. The mother had been literally talking to her cub, and potentially to them, this entire time. With this knowledge, they began to recognize patterns in the mother's vocalizations. Certain sounds were consistently associated with certain objects or actions. She had specific calls for food, for danger, for comfort, for attention. But more remarkably, she had sounds that seemed to represent abstract concepts like thank you and safe, and something that might translate to friend or trusted one, which she used when looking at the humans who had helped her. The mother seemed pleased that they were beginning to understand her communication system. She became more vocal, deliberately demonstrating different sounds and their meanings, teaching them as she taught her cub. It was a language lesson unlike any other. A bear teaching humans how to understand her kind's evolved form of communication. The fact that she wanted them to understand, that she was actively trying to bridge the communication gap, spoke to a desire for connection that transcended species boundaries. Melody watched all of this with tears in her eyes, seeing her mother's dream realized in ways Dr. Chen could never have imagined. She always believed this was possible, she said softly. Not just that animals could be intelligent, but that we could find ways to truly communicate, to understand each other across the species divide. She would be so proud to see this, to know that her bears had not only survived, but thrived and evolved. As the day of release approached, the atmosphere in the sanctuary became bittersweet. Everyone who had been involved in the rescue and treatment had formed a bond with these remarkable bears, especially the mother, whose intelligence and trust had challenged everything they thought they knew about animal consciousness. But they also understood that the bears belonged in the forest, with their own kind, living the free and wild life that Dr. Chen had envisioned for them. The mother seemed to sense the approaching departure, too. She became more active, testing her strength, encouraging her cub to move around despite his healing wounds. But she also spent time at the window, making specific calls that Avery now recognized as summons to others of her kind. She was telling her family she was coming home, that she and her cub were safe and would return soon. The fact that she expected them to be listening, to be waiting, suggested a level of social cohesion that was remarkable. On the final night before their planned release, something extraordinary happened. As Ethan was doing his evening rounds, he heard unusual sounds from outside the sanctuary. Looking out, he saw shapes moving in the moonlight at the forest edge. Bears, at least 6 of them, sitting at the tree line and looking toward the sanctuary. They weren't approaching, weren't threatening, just watching and waiting. The mother's family had come, not to rescue her, but to wait for her return. The mother saw them too, and her excitement was palpable. She made a series of calls through the window, and the bears outside responded, their voices carrying through the night air in what sounded almost like a conversation. They were checking on her, making sure she and her cub were truly safe, and she was reassuring them, telling them in her own way about the humans who had helped them. It was a moment of profound connection, not just between the bears, but between 2 intelligent species acknowledging each other's existence and worth. Melody, who had been staying at the sanctuary to be part of the release, watched with wonder. My mother always wondered if they would remember each other, if the bonds formed in captivity would survive in the wild. Look at them. They're not just a group of animals. They're a family, a community. They came for her, knowing somehow that she was here and that she would return to them. The release itself was both simple and profound. Early the next morning, with mist still clinging to the ground and the first birds beginning their dawn chorus, they opened the door to the recovery room. The mother bear emerged first, cautious but confident, her cub close beside her. His wound had healed remarkably well, leaving only a thin line that would fade with time. The mother's injuries, too, had healed, leaving her strong and capable once more. But before they left, before they returned to their hidden world in the forest, the mother did something that would be remembered forever by those who witnessed it. She turned back to face the humans who had saved her cub's life. She stood up on her hind legs, tall and magnificent in the morning light, and she spoke. Not in human words, but in her own language, a series of sounds that Avery had learned meant gratitude, trust, and promise. Then she touched her paw to her chest, over her heart, and extended it toward them, repeating the gesture she had made days before. Each human present understood the message in their own way, but the meaning was universal. Thank you. I will remember. The bridge between our worlds remains. Then she dropped to all fours, nudged her cub, and they walked toward the forest edge where the other bears were waiting. The reunion was joyful, but quiet. Lots of gentle touching and soft vocalizations as the family verified that mother and cub were truly well. Just before they disappeared into the forest, the mother turned one last time. She looked directly at Ethan, then at Avery, then at Melody, acknowledging each of them individually. Then she made a new sound, one they hadn't heard before, and her family repeated it. Avery would later analyze it and discover it was unique, created for this moment. It was the sound they would use to refer to the sanctuary and the humans there, their word for the place of healing, or perhaps the trusted ones. They had been incorporated into the bears' language, into their culture as friends and allies. As the bears vanished into the forest shadows, Melody spoke softly. My mother used to say that Project Echo wasn't about creating smarter animals. It was about discovering that intelligence and consciousness were not human monopolies, but gifts that could bloom in many forms if given the chance. These bears are living proof of that vision. They're not human, and they're not trying to be. They're something unique, something that exists in the space between wild and civilized, between animal and something more. The sanctuary returned to its normal routine, but nothing was really normal anymore. They all carried the secret now, the knowledge that in the forests around Pine Ridge lived a society of bears unlike any others on Earth. Bears that could think and plan and communicate in ways that challenged the very definition of what it meant to be sentient. Bears that remembered kindness across generations and could build bridges of trust between species that had never existed before. Ethan found himself often standing at the forest edge, especially in the early morning or late evening, listening for sounds that might indicate the bears were near. Sometimes he heard them, those distinctive vocalizations that were more than just animal sounds. Sometimes he even caught glimpses of them, shadows moving through the trees with purpose and intelligence. But they kept their distance, respecting the boundary between their worlds while knowing the bridge remained if ever it was needed again. Avery threw herself into studying the recordings and observations they had made, working with Melody to compile a comprehensive but confidential record of what they had learned. They decided not to publish their findings, at least not yet. The Project Echo Bears needed protection more than they needed fame. If the world knew about them, they would be hunted, captured, studied, their freedom and culture destroyed in the name of science. Better to keep the secret, to be the guardians of something precious and unique. But they did make preparations for the future. They established a special protocol at the sanctuary, known only to a select few, for dealing with any Project Echo Bears that might need help. They created a fund, supported quietly by Melody and others who understood the importance of what they were protecting, to ensure the sanctuary would always be there as a refuge. And they began carefully documenting the bears' language and behaviors, building a database that might one day help facilitate better communication between the species. 3 months after the release, Ethan had his most remarkable encounter yet. He was checking the far perimeter of the sanctuary when he came upon a clearing where several bears were gathered. They didn't run when they saw him. Instead, the mother bear he had treated emerged from the group and approached him slowly. Her cub was with her, fully healed and energetic, playing with other cubs in a way that suggested complex social play rather than simple roughhousing. The mother sat down a safe distance from Ethan and made a series of sounds he recognized. She was telling him about her cub's recovery, about how he was strong and healthy now. Then she did something that took his breath away. She called her cub over and seemed to introduce him to Ethan, making sounds that included the one they had created for the sanctuary humans. She was teaching her cub that Ethan was a friend, ensuring that the trust would pass to the next generation. The cub approached cautiously but without fear, sniffing in Ethan's direction before returning to his mother. Then all the bears melted back into the forest, but not before the mother made one more sound, the one Avery had identified as meaning, "Until we meet again." It was a promise and a farewell, an acknowledgement that their paths would cross again, whether in crisis or in peace, and that the bond between them would endure. As the seasons changed and life at the sanctuary continued, the story of the mother bear who refused anesthesia until her baby was safe became a legend among the staff, told in whispers to only the most trusted colleagues. But for those who had lived it, it was more than just a story. It was a reminder that the world was full of wonders that science had yet to discover, full of intelligence and consciousness in forms humans had never imagined. The Project Echo bears continued to thrive in their forest home, their culture evolving, their language developing, their society growing in complexity. Sometimes hikers reported strange sightings, bears that seemed to watch them with unusual intelligence, but these reports were dismissed as imagination or misidentification. The secret held, protected by those who understood that some miracles were too precious to share with a world that might not be ready to accept them. And in the quiet moments, when the sanctuary was peaceful and the forest was still, Ethan, Avery, and the others who knew the truth would remember that extraordinary morning when a desperate mother had trusted them with her most precious possession. They would remember the intelligence in her eyes, the deliberate nature of her actions, the bridge of understanding that had formed between species that should have been forever separate. The mother bear had shown them that consciousness was not a human monopoly, but a gift that could bloom in many forms. She had proven that love, trust, and sacrifice transcended species boundaries, and she had left them with the responsibility of protecting something precious and unique, a parallel society of intelligent beings that existed in the shadows of the human world, connected by bridges of trust that had been built through crisis and maintained through respect. Years would pass, and occasionally new Project Echo bears would find their way to the sanctuary when injured or in need. Each time, the protocol would be followed, the trust honored, the secret kept. The sanctuary staff would provide help without questions, without attempts, to study or capture, respecting the independence and culture of these remarkable beings. And each time, the bears would show the same extraordinary intelligence, the same capacity for trust, the same understanding that had characterized that first miraculous encounter. Melody Chen, carrying on her mother's legacy, would continue to visit, bringing new insights from her mother's journals and helping to deepen the understanding between the species. She would often say that her mother's greatest achievement was not creating the enhanced bears, but recognizing that they deserved freedom and respect, that intelligence in any form deserved the right to develop on its own terms. The cub that had been saved would grow strong and healthy, eventually having cubs of his own, passing on not just his enhanced genetics but the stories and knowledge his mother had shared with him. The tale of the sanctuary, the place of healing where humans could be trusted, would become part of their cultural heritage, told from mother to cub across generations. And always the bridge would remain, ready to be crossed when needed, but otherwise respected as the boundary between two worlds that had touched but remained beautifully separate. In the end, the story of the mother bear who refused anesthesia until her baby was safe was not just about animal intelligence or scientific discovery. It was about the possibility of connection across the vast divide that seemed to separate species. It was about trust given and received, about love that transcended biological boundaries, about the recognition that consciousness and emotion and intelligence were not human possessions but universal gifts that could manifest in ways humans were only beginning to understand. The sanctuary at Pine Ridge would continue its work, saving and rehabilitating wildlife, but always with the knowledge that they were guardians of something extraordinary. In the forests around them lived proof that the world was far more complex and wonderful than most people imagined, that intelligence and culture could evolve in unexpected ways, that the boundaries between human and animal were far more permeable than science had ever suspected. And sometimes, on quiet mornings when the mist hung low over the forest, staff members would hear those distinctive calls echoing through the trees, the language of the Project Echo bears, carrying messages humans could only partially understand. But one message was always clear, carried in every sound and sighting, in every moment of connection between the two species. It was the message the mother bear had conveyed with her trust, with her intelligence, with her refusal to be sedated until her baby was safe. The message was simple but profound. We are more alike than we are different, And in that recognition lies the hope for a future where multiple forms of consciousness can coexist, each respecting the other, each contributing to the magnificent diversity of life on Earth. The bridge between worlds that Dr. Sarah Chen had dreamed of building had been realized in ways she could never have imagined, not as domination or control, but as mutual respect and understanding, not as human superiority, but as recognition of the many forms intelligence could take. The Project Echo Bears were her legacy, but more than that, they were proof that the universe was far stranger and more wonderful than anyone had dared to believe. As the sun set over Pine Ridge Wildlife Sanctuary, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple, the forest seemed to pulse with hidden life and secret intelligence. Somewhere in those shadows, a mother bear was teaching her cubs about the world, using a language that no human fully understood, but that carried wisdom accumulated across generations. She would tell them about the sanctuary, about the humans who could be trusted, about the bridge between worlds that must be maintained but carefully guarded. And in the sanctuary, humans who had been forever changed by their encounter with extraordinary intelligence would continue their work, knowing that they were part of something larger than themselves. They were keepers of a secret that challenged everything humanity thought it knew about its place in the world. They were witnesses to a miracle that proved consciousness was not rare, but abundant, not limited, but diverse, not human, but universal. The story would continue, hidden from the wider world but alive in the hearts and minds of those who knew the truth. The Project Echo Bears would thrive in their forest home, their culture growing ever more complex, their language ever more sophisticated. And always the bridge would remain, a connection built on trust and maintained through respect, proof that understanding between species was not only possible but essential for a future where all forms of consciousness could flourish. The mother bear, who had refused anesthesia until her baby was safe, had given the world a gift, though most would never know it. She had shown that love transcended species, that intelligence took many forms, that trust could bridge the most unlikely divides. Her story would live on, whispered in the sanctuary halls, encoded in the secret protocols, preserved in Melody Chen's careful records. But more than that, it would live on in the forests around Pine Ridge, where bears, unlike any others on Earth, continued to evolve and thrive, carrying forward a legacy of enhanced consciousness that had begun with human intervention but had become something uniquely their own.